Welcome to another episode of Talk Track, where we talk about and respond to the news of the day that impacts the railroading community. And by that, we mean a pretty wide audience. Of course, we mean shippers, carriers, lessors, and people who are just generally interested in the economy and railroading's role in it. With me, as always, is Telegraph's co-founder and CEO, Harris Ligon. Harris, thank you very much for joining the call and giving some time to talk about the news of the day.
David, always great seeing you. It feels like we're having a few more of these discussions at a more regular cadence, which is a good sign for an industry that is typically thought of as being sleepy.
I will say I will take the opportunity to chat, and it's really because there's a lot of interesting news. And like you say, I think sometimes people don't realize how much, for lack of a better term, drama there is in railroading at the moment.
Yeah, I would completely agree with you. Again, I don't think anybody had anything related to a large scale merger on their bingo card at any point. I think that was somewhat post CPKC and the KCS kind of agreement. That was considered a kind of a uncharted territory. So I'm super excited to kind of dive in more. And I think recently, as 72 hours ago, we've got even more drama to talk.
Yeah. So let's work that way. Let's work sort of up to the present moment. And so I think the big thing that got you and me talking, and really everyone talking, is this UPCN partnership announcement that came out. And there's sort of the face value facts to it, and then there's the implications of it. So I guess my first question to you: did you see it coming? And if you didn't, how did it strike you?
Couple of different layers to this one. So I think first and foremost, definitely did not see it coming from a couple of different angles, right? So I think historically, if we look back in time, the last time CN kind of had a really good engagement, ironically, was with BNSF, and this was in the earlier part of the 2000s when there was this post UP-SP merger. There was still a lot of kind of considerations around what are the other deals that were left or potentially able on the table. And so I was candidly really surprised to see this willingness to concede after CN had been somewhat resistant to that. What drives a really good question there is when we think about the original UP Norfolk Southern application, there was a very almost sense of pride that they were not offering concessions at that stage. And so the fact that they were able to get this very unique and individual deal done with CN was candidly surprising. The second piece of that was wasn't expecting there to be this large scale concession between another major class one in this way. And here's why I was surprised by this. If we think about the way that CN is kind of operating and performing in the market, where have they felt a ton of competitive? Predominantly with CPKC. And where has that pressure really been? New service offerings that are typically multi-country and cross-border. And so it feels like CN gaining access to Eagle Pass via Union Pacific was definitely a big draw as a part of this. And so that's actually one of the things that I felt was particularly interesting as well. I know that you had a chance to listen to the CPKC earnings call yesterday. What were some of your big takeaways from that?
Sure. So yeah, the timing really worked out very interesting around the Q2 earnings calls because the timing really went UPCN announcement the very next day, UP and NS earning calls back to back, and then we just had CPKC last night, and I think hearing directly from leadership there gave a lot of color to me into how this works. So the first point I would make is, and this is something I think you and I kind of have been talking about, and it came out in your comments, is this is in some ways a competitive threat to CPKC. I mean, they're not going to say that on an earnings call with the investment community, but it came out of sort of their comments, and really, the way they chose to present that was, we're ready to compete. We are ready to compete with anyone. We believe in our product. We're ready to go, which makes perfect sense.
Which I love to hear, by the way. I love to. We actually need more, I think, of that in the industry, of railroads raising their hand and saying, I'm willing to lean in and I'm willing to really go after your business. We need more of that.
And the other piece of that, I totally agree. And, maybe, that may sort of make a competitiveness argument that they didn't mean to make with that. But the other thing I liked about how, CPKC leadership framed up that particular component of the deal was like they said, look, our business north south, particularly Canada Mexico, which they call land bridge business because you're passing right through the United States, is worth a lot of money, and we're not surprised that someone else wants to play there too, but we're ready to compete. So that makes good sense. The other part of the agreement, but maybe I will hold off on what struck me about CPKC's comments on it and sort of get your thoughts first, is the importance of Chicago to the deal and the ways around Chicago that UP gained access to. I wonder if you could speak to sort of your experience in Chicago Railroad and why it was such a big deal for UP to get access to the J, what that does for people who don't know. And then I'll share, really not my original thoughts, but what struck me about what CPKC had to say about that.
It's interesting, right? Chicago is widely known as being a quote unquote bottleneck in the industry. And I think we, even as a company, have been on record as calling that out. Whether I agree with that explicitly or not is not for this podcast. However, one of the things that I think is very interesting is that the Chicago that if you've worked in the industry for a very long time, the transit times and dwell and interchange and the flow of Chicago that you might remember from 20, 30 years ago is not the same kind of operation that's going on today. Are there delays? Yes, all the time. Are there metro trains crossing CSX trains and it's clogged up? Yeah, 100%. That's what happens when you have a natural nucleus of 7 class 1s, a commuter railroads or a commuter rail line, and various short lines that are all operating in vicinity of one another. So I don't think Chicago is necessarily like I don't think Chicago is always the bottleneck when I think about the broader rail network. So it was interesting to me to see that concession of the Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern, EJ&E, as kind of offered up as the thing that's ultimately going to solve it. I think what's really interesting is that when we think about Jim Venna's history, he worked at that space. So he knows that line segment really well. He knows what he can probably yield out of that from an operating agreement standpoint. And so it's an interesting opportunity, especially if CN is gaining Eagle Pass and some other things as a part of this. And I think the other thing that we always have to consider, right? It's not the move that I'm seeing today. It's the second or third move that may be happening. If you're anti-merger today and you're the one that's being left out, it might behoove you to be pro-merger if in the next round you would be eligible to kind of engage and do some things there. So I thought that was a really interesting piece that candidly came out of that. It's interesting to think about that being a commercial and somewhat operational partnership and operating agreement, because if that was the concession that was offered, does that give some credence that maybe you ultimately don't need to merge?
And that's precisely what the merger's detractors have really said. And I think it bears noting that there was maybe some initial optimism that this partnership between UP and CN, so not the partner that they're merging with, if they could make this partnership with a third party and please that third party, maybe that would mean everyone's going to get on board. And that has certainly not been the case from what we've seen. I mean, I feel like Katie Farmer at BNSF is mad about the merger. She's ever been since this happened, and that's certainly the case with the CPKC earning call. The story that I wanted to tell that I thought was very interesting color to the whole thing is that just like you said, there's the EG&E essentially bypass of Chicago traffic, which I've heard referred to as the holy grail of rail networks before, trying to get around that Chicago congestion. On the UP call, Venna talked about how sometimes it can take equally as long to get things across parts of Canada as it does to get them through Chicago. So there's real benefit to there. And so CPKC, interestingly, in the call said, they didn't take the shot at UP, they took it at CN for making that deal. And they said, just because you have excess capacity on that valuable line now, look at all the growth everyone's talking about in their earnings calls right now. What happens if that line gets busy? Someone will be accountable for the decision to share that limited resource. And then I think he said, whoever it is, I hope they don't have buyer's remorse. Really.
I think something we've heard mentioned by a handful of Class 1 CEOs that their version of facts or their version of opinions may differ, buyer beware, all of those things. What is interesting in underlying that comment is that, folks have always, over history, right? And Jim, having spent 30 plus years as CN, retiring as COO, he knows Chicago probably better than anybody else, right? And so he's not wrong that, structurally there are reasons why you might be able to move a lot of freight over, the barren lands of Saskatchewan, and it might take a similar amount of time to go through the congested, suburbs of Chicago. But I think that's one of the things that the EJ&E offers. Like if you've ever driven under it and think about where it's located in reference to the city of Chicago, it is a nice bypass. There are also ways that you can bypass east and west. Iowa Interstate, there's a ton of other opportunity. Shout out to any short line that can help make that happen, because I think if there's ever been an opportunity for surrounding lines in Chicago to actually make some things happen, this feels like a really good opportunity that we haven't had. It's always, it was one of the things that we talked about in a prior life. If only UPS or only FedEx could kind of get around Chicago, they'd probably save a day and a half in transit time. And so it's a really interesting thing to see that kind of coming along. Back to the whole, so I always think about things in the rail industry structurally, legally, from a regulatory standpoint. It feels like every move sets some sort of precedent, and whether there's a legal team involved or not, that doesn't mean you don't have some sort of case record to kind of review. I just keep coming back to, if you're able to make these agreements happen, and these agreements are material enough to do, and they're worth making concessions over, or they're worth paying millions and that would signal to me that you believe in good faith that they're actually going to have some value that accrues back to your franchise. So if we follow that line of reasoning, why can't all these operating agreements work day in and day out?
I think it's a fair question, and to your point specifically, that's one of what I would call the two or three main pillars of criticism of the merger.
Sure.
And one of them, that comes out of the I believe it's called the Stop the Rail merger, of which the other two Class 1s are members, is that, we have all these interline agreements and interchange agreements. Why do we need to transfer ownership as well? That's fair. I frankly think that the ambition is bigger than that. I think the ambition is to have a transcontinental railroad, to be able to go fully east to west on one line. And beyond the expediency of it, which I think we spend a lot of time thinking about, and that is probably what's top of mind for the shipper audience, there's just the notion of it, or the grandeur of it, the ability for the first time in modern U.S. history to go east to west on one network.
Yeah, it's interesting. I also think some things that came out of the revised filing, right? So there was a little bit less pressure or ideal thought around what is the true market opportunity from a truck to rail conversion opportunity. I think the total diverted intermodal units got revised down. I think the job creation number also was revised down, which is interesting if we really kind of dig in and double click into that, because it's interesting that Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern have been running advertisements about that they're going to protect a lot of labor and union jobs, or that if you have a job at the time of the merger, you're going to have a job for life. But then as you kind of dig into the filing and you read some of the fine print, what you ultimately see is really 2 points. Number one, that they are articulating, and it's definitely baked in there, submission to get it out in the process, but they are planning for job cuts. And so how that is assigned and allocated and split up, it's way too early to say. But the truth is I don't think anybody was expecting this to just be a pure revenue and growth driven story. There was always going to be overlap, and so there was always going to be some sort of reduction that happened. Where that comes from is going to be really interesting, because the way that I understand the job for life narrative to be is really around at the time of the merger, right? So I would assume there's going to be some reduction if the merger is going through prior to the actual date. The second thing is subject to labor and kind of employment agreements. And so one of the things that definitely concerns me is that we might guarantee you a job, but your job may now be in Salt Lake City, Utah, instead of Greenville, South Carolina, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or you may be furloughed for a period, and if you don't come back when you were initially called back, maybe your job has been relocated, you may not have the employment there as well. And so I applaud that they are getting out and saying we want to guarantee a strong, kind of employee basis, because as you and I have talked before, that is really one of the major levers to growth. But I find it hard to think about the math as being a cost savings mechanism when you haven't extracted costs out of the system. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch over the next many weeks and months.
And just another wrinkle on that came to mind as you were saying that is, something that happened in the last few months, not the last few weeks so much has happened recently, but I think that layers on is that, like, we've talked about the reporting that, the conversations around regulation of freight railroading made it all the way to the White House and the Vice President's office a few months ago when they were talking about proposed legislation around, should there be automated track inspections, or do we stipulate that it must be people, some rules around two-man crews, and all of that has safety implications that, there are far greater experts than me to think about. But what struck me about it was, if Vice President Vance is getting involved in those discussions, then I think that the political football has been recognized around labor implications in railroading, particularly around the merger, and that puts a whole new wrinkle on these requests for labor information and your call out of the potential for job loss, because it could be coming at a politically sensitive time. And I think the candidates from both parties will probably draw a line in the sand on how they feel about that.
Yeah, potentially. I think as we're kind of wrapping up here, a couple of other like oddball items that came up as I was kind of going through it and really kind of processing it. Gateway pricing is one of the things that I've always just kind of like thought is, if the market is truly competitive, then the prices in theory should be competitive. And so this committed gateway thing is, I know it's like an anti-protectionism act, but it feels like they're, I appreciate that we're going to guarantee that, but I don't know actually how much traffic moves specifically through those gateways and through those specific pricing mechanisms. And so a lot of traffic interchanges, I'm not sure exactly how much transmits through those specific gateways. The fact that there's somewhat of a time boxing around that doesn't feel great to me. So if I'm a shipper and I'm thinking about that, so all of a sudden my price is going to go up 50% in 5 years, that's a question that I definitely. And then as I was thinking more about what happens what happens in the downside standpoint. What if a shipper needs to go through some sort of arbitration process? And so the fact that that was somewhat resurrected, and there is a sense that arbitration outside of the STB is kind of like a path that some folks want to pursue. Having worked at a railroad and participated in some arbitration proceedings, I think for some of the things that I was doing on claims and litigation stuff, fairly simple arbitration made sense. I'm just not 100% sure how I feel about arbitration for a shipper that may have felt wrong for some period of time, having to go towards like a retired judge or some independent party, and that case is being processed in private and is never made public record, and so that others can't potentially benefit or understand that. Again, going back to kind of this like pseudo structure of regulation and precedent, I do have some concern there, and that's one of the things that I really appreciate about the STB. When they make a ruling, it's all searchable, and I think everybody's afforded the opportunity to understand why they made a decision in a certain way.
I really like that framing. I guess I would just add to it that another wrinkle of this whole thing is that if your point, and I think it's well taken, is sure there's an arbitration mechanism, but does a shipper really have a chance in independent arbitration? And that's as it stands now. If this is the first transcontinental railroad, just the size of it is gigantic. I mean, I was looking at what some of even the dividend payouts of a railroad that big would be compared to the annual budget of something like the FRA. it's bigger. Like this would be a huge entity. And on top of that, I'm still of the belief that as a condition of merger approval, the US government will get a stake in the railroad. So now you're a
Mm.
shipper going up against an entity bigger than anything you've ever fought before that is also government backed.
Yeah, so interesting, and you know, there's never a perfect time to bring up AI and talk about railroading and regulation, but July 30th of 2026 affords us so many opportunities to find the crossover. It has been interesting to see how OpenAI and other folks are saying, please add regulation. We're moving too quickly. Sam and at OpenAI offering up 5% directly to the government. As you and I have kind of talked about offline, what are really the incentives there? And so if you do want to get something done or you do want to influence policy, giving the U.S. government an equity stake at this stage is it seems to be somewhat being normalized, which is candidly very interesting considering how we perceive things to be happening over in China, right? Especially with like frontier model development and those things. So it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. Candidly, I don't think we have a date for kind of the next move, do we?
No, it's up in the air. Depends. I mean, I think some people think the clock started as soon as the first application was submitted, but then there was that ruling of holding it in abeyance, so it could go on for another year. On to that, and this is maybe just to add some color to your point. I've been sort of putting my shingle out, selling that idea to the world that I think a government stake in the Transcon is coming. And sometimes it's well received, sometimes it's very poorly received. And what I've seen is that it is very well received outside of the railroading community. People who watch the economic news but don't have railroading experience hear that argument, say, "Oh yeah, that tracks with U.S. Steel, that tracks with OpenAI, that tracks with everything else happening in the economy. We're going to have a national champion railroad in 2028." Within the railroading community, when I make that prediction, people say that is crazy talk. So it has been quite interesting to me to see that dichotomy of views, and I guess it makes sense because it would be a new world, and it never feels like a new world is about to take place until it does.
Right. Yeah, that is a very good point of perception and kind of yeah. I mean, it's kind of like getting thrown in a pot that is like very nice. It's like if you're in a hot tub and all of a sudden the temperature goes up. Do you really notice? Probably not. And I think that's kind of like where we're at. Folks, it has been awesome that you have been able to spend a little bit more time and listen to Dave and I go back on some recent news of the day. Again, here at Telegraph and especially in Talk Track, we really appreciate having a ton of discussion about the news and what's going on in the day to day. If you have specific questions that you would love for David Carell to weigh in on, he is more than happy to do it, and we will welcome that. So please reach out. Our website is at www.telegraph.io. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you.